take care of the little extra stuff. All right. Apparently it didn't change like it's supposed to. All right, we'll worry about that later. We'll fix the screen. If you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, it may have this listed as our worship for this past Sunday. That is not correct. This is our FBI class. We will change that as soon as we finish class. This is class number 7, I believe, looking at the Old Testament. Last week, we finished talking about the book of Genesis. We are a couple weeks behind our schedule, but as I said last week, that's no problem. We will catch up with that either at the end of this time or beginning of next semester. We've got plenty of time to catch up and get those things working like we need to. All right, let me verify one last thing, and then we'll get started with our class. All right, I think we're ready and going. All right, I can get the right screen next. All right, here we are. We are finishing up. We finished last week up. We finished up last week about the book of Exodus. Today we continue, or finish up Genesis, I'm sorry. And this week we go into the book of Exodus. You remember we talked about Genesis is that story of Abraham, and from Abraham to Isaac, and then from Isaac to Jacob, and Jacob to Joseph. We've talked about that, what they did and what was accomplished. At the end of Genesis sort of leaves us hanging with the story of what's next, what has happened. And so when you read these books, these Old Testament books, especially the first 5, you'll see that they're actually one continuous story, one continuous account, and that's why they're typically listed together as the Torah or the law. And so as we look at that, we see that Exodus is that next book in that chain. And the book of Exodus deals with the birth and organization of a nation through whom the Savior would come. This is going to tell us about the Israelites, what makes them God's people, what set into motion to bring about the Savior and bring about the importance of the New Testament. This is that idea we talked about, that when we see the Old Testament, then we can have a good understanding of the New Testament, even better understanding of the New Testament. You notice the last point here, the book Exodus, the title Exodus comes from a Greek word. This is a Greek word meaning departure or way out, or to exit. And that's what the Exodus is about, is the exiting of Israel from Egypt. So we begin in Exodus chapter 1. Exodus chapter 1 deals with Pharaoh's treatment of the Israelites. You remember we're told in those verses that there came a Pharaoh into power who did not know Joseph, did not know his history, did not even know why the Israelites were here. And they feared the Israelites lest they join with some of their enemies and therefore revolt against Egypt and bring their nation down. And so they began to mistreat them. They became slaves. You remember they began to kill newborn children. Remember they began by telling the Hebrew midwives to kill a boy when he's born. The Hebrew midwives did not do that. So Pharaoh passed a law that said that if you see an Israelite child, you are a Hebrew child, you throw it in the Nile River. And then in chapter 2, we get introduced to Moses. Now, we're not introduced to Moses' mother or any of his other family by name yet. We'll see that in chapter 6. We find out Moses' mother, whose name is Jochebed, has this beautiful child. And I've always thought that was interesting that he describes Moses as a good child, a beautiful child, a fair child. And she has had to take care of it. And what's interesting about that is I know very few parents who wouldn't look at their child and feel the same way. So Jochebed begins to take care of Moses, and what she does, she raises him in her house for 3 months, the Bible tells us, and then she decides that she can't hide anymore, so she puts him in the reeds near the Nile River. She puts him in the reeds where it's known that either Pharaoh or his family, or maybe just the wealthy families, go to bathe. And so as Pharaoh's daughter, by chance or providence, goes down to the river to bathe, she sees the basket. She sends one of her maidens after it. They get the basket and bring it back. And she takes Moses as her own. And then she not only takes Moses as her own, she pays Moses' mother, to raise him and to nurse him. And so this is after Miriam, Moses' sister, sees the Pharaoh's daughter do this and says, I can go get you a Hebrew nurse. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Moses' mother, in technicality, was obeying Pharaoh's command, but not the heart of the idea of what Pharaoh had in mind. Pharaoh wanted them to cast the babies in the Nile by themselves, but she builds Moses a bow or a basket or an ark. The word is used, ark, that Moses lives in. And so Moses begins to grow up in Pharaoh's household after he's weaned, and the weaning time would have been after a few years, 4 or 5 maybe years old. And he goes to Pharaoh's house, but even in being in Pharaoh's house, he still knows his heritage. And then we see in verse 11 through 15 of chapter 2, Moses' first attempt at delivery of Israel. Now, as hinted at in Exodus, Stephen in Acts 7 will lay this out, and he will tell us very, very plainly that Moses here was attempting to deliver Israel. He sees an Israelite being mistreated by an Egyptian slave master. So remember, he looks this way and that, sees no one looking, and he kills the Egyptian and buries him. The next day, he goes to help 2 Israelites who are fighting, and one of the Israelites turns on him, the one who's in the wrong. Moses tries to stop them from fighting and asks why he's doing it. He says, who made you ruler and prince over us? Ruler and judge over us, excuse me. And then Moses knows that what he's done has been found out, so Moses flees. Now, Exodus doesn't tell us, but the book of Acts, I said a minute ago, Stephen will tell us that Moses was 40 years old when this happened. And then at age 40, Moses goes into the wilderness of Midian. A very interesting story happens when he gets to Midian, and that he takes care of Jethro's daughters and their sheep. Therefore, Jethro invites him into his house. Jethro is a high priest of God, or a priest of God in Midian. And Jethro gives Moses a wife, and Moses lives a very happy life. He has 2 children, one in Jethro's household. And he spends 40 years in the land of Midian. And then at the end of chapter 2, we see the Israelites cry out to God after a new Pharaoh comes to power who's mistreated them as well. And when they cry out to God, it says that God hears them or God remembers them. Now, the idea here, as I mentioned in our Wednesday night class a few weeks ago, we say this. The idea here of remembering the Israelites is not that God forgot them and said, oh, yeah, I forgot. I better go take care of those people. No, the idea of remembering is that God has decided to act. God has decided that now is the time to fulfill the promise. The same word remember is used in the book of Genesis chapter 6, Genesis about 8 or 9, where it talks about God remembers Noah on the ark. And the idea wasn't, again, that he forgot Noah on the ark, but that he remembered the promise he made, and it was time to deliver Noah and therefore to lower the water. So this is what God does. And the way God does that, as we most of us probably know, is by the burning bush. That bush that Moses sees that burns as if it's on fire, but is never consumed. It burns, but it never is fully engulfed. And so what happens is that Moses is out in the wilderness tending his sheep, and he sees an unusual sight, that burning bush. And when he comes to the burning bush, he cries out, or he sees a bush that's burning with no, again, not like regular fire. It's not being consumed. And God speaks to him. Remember, God tells me to take off his sandals, for where he stands is holy ground. Where he's at is a holy place, and therefore he has to be wary of where he is. And God begins to tell Moses, this is what you're going to do. I'm going to send you back to Israel, to Egypt. I'm going to send you to Israel in Egypt, and you're going to bring my people out. Now, remember, 40 years ago, Moses was more than willing to do this. Moses was more than willing to bring his people out to go deliver the Israelites and bring them home. But now Moses, after 40 years being rejected and having to flee his home and everything he had, Moses is hesitant. In chapter 3 and 4, Moses gives God 5 excuses. And you can imagine how this goes. If you ever studied, I'm sure we've all studied this. But when you give God an excuse, it doesn't hold weight. You notice what God gives, or Moses gives 5 excuses to God, and then God answers every excuse. The first excuse is found in Exodus 3, verse 11, where Moses says, well, who am I? Who am I that the Israelites will listen to him? Well, why did he say that? Well, again, because they just told him 40 years ago, who made you prince and judge over us? Who made you ruler over us? We're not going to listen to you. So Moses says, who am I that they're going to listen to me? And God says, I'm with you. God is with you. God is behind you. Then Moses follows that up with another question and says, well, who are you? Who are you, the God of Abraham and Isaac, that they're going to believe me? Who's going to say that I'm not just some crazy man? How are we going to prove this? And God says, and Moses says, well, who are you? And God says, I am that I am. That famous phrase of God, I am. The idea that God is there in the present always. He's always been here, always will be here, always has been here. And he reveals to Moses that I am. And then from there, Moses goes and he says, well, why should they believe me? Why would they listen to me? And God says in chapter 4, beginning in chapter 4, about verse 1, for Moses gives an excuse, verse 2, God tells Moses, here's how they're going to believe you. He says, what's in your hand first? And Moses says, a staff. You remember the account, I hope. God tells him, throw the staff on the ground. He throws the staff on the ground, and what happens? To me, it's one of the, I guess, funniest verses, one of the funniest verses encountered to me. And I guess I can relate to Moses here because if you read the text, it says when Moses throws the staff on the ground, it becomes a snake and Moses runs away. Moses is about like us. You see a snake, you're going to run, especially when your staff becomes a snake. It becomes a snake, and God has to tell Moses to touch it by the tail, grab its tail, and it'll become a real staff again. And I wonder that when I see that, I wonder if that shows us how skittish Moses is. God doesn't say grab it by the head or grab it by up close, but just grab it by the tail. Just reach out and grab the tail, the easiest, least defensive, least harmful part of the snake. And Moses does it. It becomes a snake. Then the second sign is God tells Moses, take your hand. Take your hand and put it in your breast pocket. Now, the idea is he would have a robe and he would slide this hand in his pocket. And God says, pull it out. And when he pulls it out, it's covered in leprosy, a visible disease, a visible infection that is eating his skin and eating his flesh. And then God says, put it back. And so Moses puts it back into his cloak. And God says, take it out again. When he returns it back out the second time, it's clean, it's pure, it's whole. And God says, these are two signs for you to show Israel that I am who I say I am. And not only that, these are signs that he's going to do to show Pharaoh. And then the third sign, God says, he doesn't do the sign in the wilderness where he's at with Moses. But God tells Moses, take some water from the Nile. And when you take some water from the Nile, you pour it out on the ground. He said that water is going to become blood. And that when they see the blood, they'll know. And so God tells Moses, he answers the excuse of why would they believe you? Well, God uses miracles to prove. And this is a very interesting thing that we need to realize in the Bible, that when miracles occur, when miracles are done, they are done for the reason, with the purpose, to show that the speaker speaks from God, to show that God is behind it. Same is true of all the prophets, same is true of the apostles, same is true of Jesus, that God uses these miracles to prove that his called people are his people, that they are his servants, his mouthpieces, if you will. And so after this, he gives these three signs, these irrefutable signs of who he is. Moses comes back with probably one of the last two are probably the most I hate to say sincere excuses, but the most reasonable excuses Moses could give. One, he says, I'm not an eloquent speaker. I don't speak good. I can't get my words out right, is what he would say. We probably all had that idea where someone asks us to speak and to do something. We're going to say, oh, well, I'm not very good at speaking in public. Well, God tells Moses, don't be afraid. He said, who made your mouth? Who made your tongue? Who made the blind? Who makes the deaf? He said, it's God. And if I can make all this, and I have made all this, then I will allow you to use your tongue, use your mouth for all its words. And then lastly, in chapter 4, verse 13, God goes to Moses, and Moses comes to God the last time and says, God, please send somebody else. Please let someone else go in my space. And God tells him, behold, Aaron, your brother, is on his way. He's on his way now. You go talk to him, and he will be your spokesman. But the interesting thing about this is that Moses wants to get out of this, and Moses wants God to let Aaron do it all. But God says, here's what's going to happen. You're going to call Aaron. You're going to tell Aaron what's going on, and Aaron will be your prophet. And so what God does is God changes the way he talks to people for a while, and that typically God speaks to a prophet, a man, and that man speaks to the people. In Moses' case, because Moses refused to speak for God at first, God says, I'm going to speak to you, Moses, Then you're going to tell Aaron what I told you, and then Aaron's going to deliver that message to the people. And this is how it's going to be for a while. And then we're going to see at the beginning, we see Aaron being a very key part, that Aaron being the speaker. But later on, as the time progresses, we're going to see that line get blurred. We're going to start to see Moses take on that role that God intended him to do from the beginning of that as the speaker. And so God gives Moses no way out. And God says, you're going to Egypt. You're going to deliver my people. And so in chapter 5, from chapter 5, verse 1 to chapter 6, verse 13, we see Moses goes before Pharaoh. He goes to the Israelites and tells them who he is, does the signs to prove that he's from God. He then goes and tells Pharaoh, this is what I'm going to do. This is what you're going to do. You are going to let my people go. You're going to let my people go. And what Moses asked for is Moses asked to go for a journey for a free feast. He says, let us go out into the wilderness. Let us travel out and let us go have a feast. And the idea is they're going to go have a week or two feast to celebrate and honor their God, to worship their God. And then Moses says, we're going to come back. Just let us go out, let us get out of Egypt, let us go back to our land and have this feast, or close to our land, and have this feast, and then come back to you. Now, some people question whether or not this was Moses' original idea, and I think it is, or the intention is that if Pharaoh would have said yes, then Moses would have done this very thing. But God has already told Moses that this is what's going to happen. When you tell Pharaoh this, I'm going to harden his heart, or I'm going to allow his heart to be hardened. I'm going to allow him not to just bow down to you, not to give in to your request. And he said, I'm going to do this so that Pharaoh will know I'm God, and you will know I'm God, and the people will know I'm God. And so this is what Moses does. And I think we all know the story. What happens next is when Pharaoh gets called out by Moses, Pharaoh begins to demand a higher output of bricks from the slaves. And he begins to make their burdens even worse. And it gets so bad that eventually the Israelites come to Moses and say, we've been better off if you wouldn't even come. Why are you doing this horrible thing to us? But Moses assures them, and God assures them, they will be delivered. Just wait for his timing. And then we get to the middle of chapter 16, beginning in verse 14 and going through verse 27, where we see the genealogy of Moses. Moses is traced of his father and where his father came from. And not just the genealogy of Moses, but the families all around. And so we're caught up with where the people are at this time. Because genealogy is a very important thing to the Israelites. And that's when we see so many genealogies given in the Bible. Next, when Moses and Pharaoh go into the Pharaoh to petition and let Israel go, this is what they asked for. Let us go for a 3-day journey to a feast and worship our God. Let us travel 3 days. The idea is going to take 3 days to get there, a week to feast, and 3 days to get back. So they're basically asking for 2 weeks to go and worship our God. And then Pharaoh makes this answer in Exodus chapter 5, verse 2. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. Very powerful statement by Pharaoh when he says, who is God that I should obey him? Now remember, in Egyptian culture, Pharaoh was a god. Pharaoh was a god himself. And for Pharaoh to bow down and allow another god to tell him what to do, the Egyptians wouldn't have liked that. And so here's why Pharaoh stands up against him. And Pharaoh says, I know not God, neither will I let Israel go. What's interesting is what we're going to see, and what we all know comes next, is that Pharaoh's fixing to find out who God is. And he's going to understand why he should obey God, because God is the God of all things, the God of all mankind. And so what we see next at the end of Exodus chapter 6, beginning verse 28, going to verse 7, verse 13, Moses comes again to Pharaoh and demands to let Israel go, demands to let Israel free, and demonstrates his power with signs. Remember that Moses does some signs, or Aaron does some signs, and the Egyptian magicians try to copy them, but Moses' sign is still better. And then finally, God comes to Moses, and God tells Moses in chapter 7, verse 14, Pharaoh's heart is hard and he refuses to let the people go. And he says, this is what I want you to do. And so the first of the 10 plagues began. The first plague is that God comes to Pharaoh, or Moses comes to Pharaoh when he's out in the water. He's probably on a boat. We really don't know if he's there, if he's in or is taking his bath. What he's doing anyway, he's at the water, and Moses comes out, and God tells Moses, "You tell Aaron, take your rod and hold it over the Nile River, and I'm going to turn it into blood." And so here you have the first plague. The water turns to blood. A very amazing miracle. What's interesting is this is one of the three miracles that God told Moses to do to prove that he's God. Except now it wasn't just a bucket, a cup of water, but it was the whole Nile. And so the whole Nile turns red, and not just the Nile River. If you read this, every source of water they had turned to blood and turned from water to blood. And so Pharaoh is again in a bad spot. And what happens is the water turns to blood. The Nile goes rancid. The fish die. All that lives in the river dies. The water cannot be used. But Pharaoh hardens his heart because his people are able to copy this plague in a smaller version. And so Pharaoh hardens his heart. And then you notice that there were 7 days that passed after this. And then after some time, we don't really know how long. When we typically think of these plagues hitting bam, 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 we're not told in the Bible how quickly these plagues hit. But then comes the second plague. And that is the idea of the frogs. Again, this is the frogs that attack Egypt. These frogs come out of the Nile, and as they come out of the Nile, they go everywhere. They get into beds, they get into cabinets, they get into bowls. Anywhere and everywhere they can get, these frogs jump into. And they're such a nuisance that Pharaoh comes and begs Moses to let this get out. He had hoped that Moses would let him out. And he tells Moses, "I'll let you go if you'll get rid of the frogs." And God says, or Moses says, "I'll do it tomorrow." And then Pharaoh says, "Let this be." But the interesting thing about this is the next day comes and the frogs are gone, but the frogs don't disappear, go back to Nile. The frogs die. The frogs just die everywhere they are. And so the Egyptians are left and the Israelites are left with a huge mess because these frogs are everywhere. And again, this is a plague that the servants of Pharaoh could copy. The next is the plague of lice. God told Pharaoh or Moses that this is what he's going to do. And he goes out and has Aaron, as you see here in the picture, strike the ground. And when he strikes the ground, the dust that flies up becomes lice. And lice begins to infect the whole people. It begins to infect the entire land, except this time, and this is what's interesting, is the magicians could not copy this. Pharaoh's men could not copy this plague. And so they tell Pharaoh, this is the work of a god. This is the finger of God, they say. But Pharaoh hardens his heart and doesn't listen. And so after the plague of lice, come the plague of flies. And the plague of flies comes out into the land of Egypt. They come out and they go into the entire land. There's flies. There are so many flies that it is inconceivable how bad they are. And here's where God does something very interesting. This shows that this is not just a natural occurrence of flies or a healthy year of bugs. In that God tells Moses, this is what I'm going to do from now on. And we're going to see from the fourth plague on, the first three plagues, Egypt and Goshen, where Israel is affected. After the fourth plague, only Egypt is afflicted. Never is Goshen afflicted again. And so the plague of flies come. And again, they infect everywhere. They come everywhere except to the land of Goshen. And again, Pharaoh begs Moses to let it go, to entreat the word of God and entreat that you can go do this. But Pharaoh begins to bargain with God in the fourth plague. And this is what we begin to see, is Pharaoh says, this is what I'll do. I'll let you go and sacrifice to your God, but you can't go too far. Don't go 3 days journey. Just go a short journey. I'll let you go a short journey. And so we see Pharaoh beginning to bargain with Moses and beginning to bargain with God. And again, Pharaoh said that he would let them go a short way. But then Moses warns him. And Moses warns him not to deal deceitfully with the people, but Pharaoh says he will not. Moses calls the plague to end, but after the plague ends, Pharaoh again hardens his heart, and he didn't let the people go. And then after some time comes the fifth plague, the livestock pestilence. This is a time when all the livestock of Israel, or Egypt, is struck. All of Israel's livestock is struck with this plague. They're killed. All of Israel's livestock, however, survives. Egypt's livestock dies. Israel survives. Now, here's an interesting thing that God does here. God gives Israel a very important position here because they're the only ones with livestock. They're the only ones with the animals to provide milk, the only ones with the animals to provide the necessities, the meat that they would need. Again, they didn't eat meat like we did, but they ate meat was a very high thing in certain places. And so for them to strike the livestock dealt a very serious blow to Egypt. Then after that comes the bulls, where God again has Aaron go out. He tells Aaron to take, or Moses to take ashes from a furnace and to throw it up in the air. And as those ashes blow around, where it lands on the Egyptians will become boils. It will become the boils, the sores on men that were so severe they had to scratch it out. But again, this happens to the magicians, we're told, and all the Egyptians, but still Pharaoh hardened his heart. Pharaoh refused to stop. Then we get to the seventh plague of hail, where God says he'll send hail from the heavens above. And so what the hail does is it comes in, and again, by this time, some of the Egyptians have livestock back again. They probably bought it from the Israelites or had to buy it elsewhere. And so Moses comes out, and Moses warns the people that tomorrow there will be a hailstorm. Tomorrow, God will show his power from the heavens. And what's interesting about this is that we're told that some of the Egyptians, when they are told what Moses said was going to happen, they kept their livestock and their servants home that day. Now, there were others who refused to obey, refused to acknowledge God, refused to serve God, that they still sent their servants out. They still sent their livestock out with no care, no worry about what's going to happen. And what does happen is that the livestock and the people are struck down because of the hail. It was such a horrible hail that it destroyed the livestock, destroyed the plants. And so it ravages the people, not just the plants. It destroys the fields, destroys the trees. There's very much damage that occurs because of this hail. And then after the hail comes the locust. The locust would come from God. The locust would come and they would go like they march like an army. Israel have said before that God the historians have gave accounts of these locust plagues. In the 50s, there was one given in Israel about this plague of locusts, and they said it's like an army that marches, that will not stop for anything. And that's the idea of these locusts. They're going to march, and they devour anything in their way. They don't go around anything, don't fly over anything. They basically climb up and go over and eat whatever they can. It's such a good thing that one of the article I read about this that always made me realize how bad this locust plague was is one of the reporters was in Israel. I believe it was Israel where this plague was in the 50s. It was the worst plague they had seen for years, if ever. And he described the car going down the road that it ran over some of these locusts, but the locusts behind them didn't stop. The locusts that were run over in front of them, what the locusts behind them did, they didn't stop or go over or avoid the dead. They just ate them up. And that's just a chilling picture to think of those locusts that are squashed and flattened in front of them. But these locusts that followed them just ate them up, and they ate up all the plants. They ate up all the crops. They stripped the land bare. Until Moses again, or Pharaoh again, begs to let Moses, to have Moses take this away. And again, he cries out to Moses and to God to relieve him, to take this away. He says he sinned against God. He's done wrong against God. And again, the wind blows and blows the locusts into the Red Sea. As soon as the plague's over, Pharaoh hardens his heart again and refuses to let the people go. And then we get to the ninth plague. The ninth plague is that plague of darkness, where there's darkness over the land for 3 days. Darkness that you could not get out, you couldn't see anybody, that everybody stayed in their place. The only place where you could have light was in the house of the children of Israel. I've often wondered what it must have been like for this ninth plague of darkness, where you were condemned or confined to home and you didn't get out much. I hate to say it, in the year 2020, we probably come as close to any time of experiencing this during this virus, of how at the beginning of this, everything shut down and we just stuck at home and couldn't do anything. You know how people were getting stir crazy and they weren't liking it. Imagine being in darkness for 3 days. And this is what happens to the Egyptians. And God is proving who he is. God is proving what he's going to do. And finally, this leads us into the last plague. Now, what's interesting about this plague is that at the end of this, verse 27 of chapter 10 of Exodus says, "But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. Then Pharaoh said to him, 'Get away from me, take heed to yourself, and see my face no more. For the day you see my face, you shall die.' So Moses said, 'You have spoken well. I will never see your face again.'" What's interesting to me about this is that Pharaoh says, you leave, Moses, never come back. If you come back, basically, I'm going to kill you. And Moses says, okay, I'm not going to come back. You will not see my face, with me coming to you is the implication. And we know that statement of Pharaoh sets up the last plague. And that is the last plague and the feast that's associated with it, the feast of Passover. And that is the plague of the death of the firstborn. This is what happens in chapters 11 and chapter 12 of Exodus. What happens is, is we see the Passover. You remember God gives certain instructions in chapter 11 and halfway through chapter 12 that what's going to happen is he's going to come and he's going to kill the firstborn of every house. The Hebrews, of all the Egyptians, the only ones who are going to escape this is the Hebrews who have done a certain thing. And the certain thing that they have done is they've put in blood on the mantle and on the frames of their door. If they mark their doors with blood, God will pass over them. He'll miss them. He'll skip them. And so Moses here, in writing this history, he records for us and for the Israelites who reads this later, Israel, that this is the foundation for the Passover, a feast in which they were to eat a lamb that was fully cooked, that was boiled and then roasted over a fire with nothing stripped off, none of the insides removed. They were to eat it that night and the next morning to burn whatever was left over. This is the feast that they eat the unleavened bread because they couldn't have time. They didn't have time for their bread to leaven, so they had to eat unleavened bread. This is the very feast, and this is why, just a little history, I think most of us know this, but just a little backup. This is why the New Testament, when we do the Lord's Supper, we do unleavened bread, because it was the Passover. That was one of the meals where they had to eat unleavened bread. And the whole point of the Passover was to remember what God had done, to remember how God had passed over Israel and saved Israel from Egypt. It's very interesting when you look at those elements of the Passover and compare them to the elements of the Lord's Supper, of how as they were called to remember how the Lord passed over them with this death of the firstborn, we are called to remember the Lord's death, to remember our Passover, where he passed over our sins and forgave us our sins. And again, this is a beautiful image that we miss if we don't understand the Old Testament. And so what happens is that after the Passover that night, the angel passes through and he skips over the houses with the blood on the door. But every other house, every other place, every other residence is hit. We're told from Pharaoh's house to the lowest servant, the firstborn son dies. And when the firstborn son dies, God has set into motion what he wants to do. Remember chapter 5 and 5 short chapters, Pharaoh's went from who is this God that I shall obey him? Who is this God that I will believe him? To he now tells Moses to leave, to get out. And that's what we see beginning here in chapter 12. Chapter 12, beginning in verse 37 and going through 51, we see the Exodus beginning. The Exodus is preparing to go. And Pharaoh comes to Moses, and he tells Moses and Aaron to rise and get out, leave. We want you gone from our people forever. And so again, Moses and the people take their bread, they leave, they take the jewelry from their neighbors, because you can imagine this. Imagine a group of people living among you, and because they live among you, because you've mistreated them, their God has just struck your firstborn dead. This is a major blow to Pharaoh. The next Pharaoh in line ought to be Pharaoh's oldest son, but now that son's gone. That son's been taken by a foreign god. And so now the Egyptians want the Israelites gone no matter what the cost. No matter what it costs them, no matter how bad it is, no matter how many slaves they lose, they want them gone. And in Exodus chapter 13, we see again the significance of the Passover, where Moses reminds the people, this is what you're doing. This is why we're doing it. And so that's what we see in Exodus 13. We get to Exodus 13 verses, the end of that chapter, verse 17 through 22, to where God leads Israel out. It's very interesting. God leads Israel out of Egypt. He leads them to the edge of the Red Sea, and the Egyptians change their minds again, and Pharaoh does and pursues Israel. And what happens is that Israel gets to the Red Sea, and they look around them, and to the right and to the left, they see desert. They see nothing but wilderness, desert, all around, no way of escape. Behind them, they see the dust of Pharaoh's army coming after them. In front of them, they see the Red Sea. And they come to Moses and say, how dare you bring us out here to die? Were there not enough graves in Egypt to bury us, Moses? Why did you bring us out here? And then Moses stands, and Moses, I don't think knows what God's about to do. Moses comes and God speaks to him, and God says, Moses, hold out your rod. Hold out your staff over the sea. And then we have that great story of biblical deliverance, where Moses holds out his rod over the sea and the waters part. And not only do the waters part and create land, they create dry land. Notice how important that is. There's dry ground. Israel can travel with no hindrance. Israel can travel from one side of the Red Sea to the other. And here you've got a group, a nation of 1.5 to 2 million people who are leaving Egypt. They've got to get across this Red Sea. Well, Pharaoh's army is coming in fast. So what happens? God confuses them. God puts the cloud of fire in front of Egypt, or Israel this time. God goes behind Israel, puts the pillar of cloud behind them, where Pharaoh and his army can't see what they're doing. And then when Pharaoh and his army try to go down into the sea, he causes them trouble. He causes them trouble where their chariot wheels begin to fall off. The land begins to get moist again, the ground, and they begin to have trouble. Until finally, when Israel's on the other side of the sea and all those people have passed through, God tells Moses, stretch out your hand over the water again. And when Moses stretches out his hand over the water, the walls crash down and Pharaoh's army is destroyed. And then in chapter 15, beginning verse 1 and going through verse 21, we have those beautiful songs to Moses, or to God. Those beautiful songs, the song by Moses, the song by Miriam, the praises to God of what he's done, of how he had brought Israel out of Egypt, and he has delivered them to the other side of the Red Sea, and now they are on their way to the promised land. Now, what's interesting about this chapter, verse 15, or chapter 15, verse 20, the interesting thing about this is just a little Bible trivia top note. This is the first time we see Moses' sister's name. We see Miriam is finally named here. So this is what happens in Exodus chapter 15. We're going to stop tonight. This is the red arrow here. If you can see it, this is the proposed journey that Israel took. They would have started here in the land of Goshen around Ramesses. They would have gone down here, and somewhere right here would have crossed the Red Sea. Now, what's interesting about this is you'll see these dotted lines. These are established paths that were already established that people traveled on to go to Egypt. For whatever reason, God doesn't send them the easy way. God sends them the long way. Some people think it's because they think that God knows that if they're on this easy path, there's no way to stop Pharaoh's army, no simpler way, or Pharaoh could continue to pursue them. But God sends them to wander. God sends them down here into Sinai. Here's Mount Sinai at the tip of that peninsula. And so this is where we're going to see next week is when Israel comes into this next part of the journey. And then we're going to talk about them getting up here and getting ready to go into the wilderness and what happens to them. And so you can imagine if you see this red line where the red ball is, the laser is, This is where they try to enter the promised land the first time and fail. And then they're forced to wander. They're all in this southern area to wander for 40 years until God finally brings them back over here through Edom and up through Moab and into the land of Canaan. But we'll get there in a few weeks. For tonight, we're going to stop right here at Exodus chapter 15. We're going to end with Exodus 15 and get to Exodus. We'll begin next week with Exodus chapter 16. I appreciate everyone's joining us here tonight. Don't forget, next Tuesday night, we will pick back up here in Exodus 16, the end of chapter 15, and we'll talk to 16 and see about Moses and the law. We're going to see the law that God gives Moses. We're going to see the tabernacle. We're going to see what happens to Israel in that first part of the wilderness journey. And then we're going to continue there in the next few weeks to see them in the wilderness and what happens. Again, I appreciate everyone being here tonight. Appreciate you joining us. Like I say, don't forget next Tuesday night, we'll pick back up here at 7 p.m. Appreciate, again, you being with us. Hope you're having a good week, and we hope to see you all next Tuesday.